While she slept, a sudden clap of thunder shattered the silence, immediately followed by the crashing sound of a vase breaking upstairs. Following the noise, Caroline hurried to her employer Ben's room. Strangely, Ben, who had been completely paralyzed, had disappeared from the room into thin air. Sensing something was wrong, Caroline quickly searched the rest of the villa, but Ben was nowhere in sight. Then it struck her. Ben's room had been locked from the inside, with only a window as a possible exit. Sure enough, she saw Ben struggling to climb outside the window. She called out, trying desperately to pull him back. To her horror, Ben reacted in sheer terror, scrambling outward, and in his panic he lost his grip and fell. Caroline rushed downstairs to help him, and Ben's wife Annie, awakened by the commotion, hurried over. Oddly, Annie paid no mind to Ben's injuries and instead demanded to know if Caroline was going to give him his medication. Before Caroline could speak, Annie urgently pushed her to wheel Ben back at once. Back in the room, Caroline was shocked to see that Ben had scrawled a desperate message on the bedsheet. With no time to think, she quickly stuffed the sheet into the wardrobe and rushed out, pushing the wheelchair. As she helped Ben to his feet, Caroline caught a glimpse of sheer despair and resistance in his eyes, and a chill ran down her spine. Determined to uncover the truth, she went downstairs early the next morning and soon discovered a small river. As she approached the riverbank, Ben's estate lawyer, Luke, suddenly called out to her. Caroline quickly recounted the bizarre events of the previous night to Luke, but he couldn't believe such an absurd tale. To prove her point, she brought the sheet from the night before to show him, but the distressing message had vanished, and Luke comforted her, suggesting it might have been a hallucination caused by stress. Before she could argue back, Annie suddenly pushed the door open and walked in. The moment she saw the two of them alone together, her expression immediately darkened with disapproval.
I see the children are getting acquainted.
You know you're the only woman in my life.
I know no such things, and remove your perspirations.
Their cryptic words only fueled Caroline's growing suspicions. She had a feeling the house was hiding something. Little did she know, the nightmare had begun the very moment she set foot in the estate. A few days earlier, having just resigned from her hospital job, Caroline spotted a high-paying job advertisement in the newspaper. Although the position was in a remote suburb, the $1,000 weekly pay was enough to catch her attention. Without a second thought, she drove straight to the estate, stopping at a gas station along the way. As she prepared to pay, she noticed a line of red brick powder drawn across the entrance, an apparent ward against evil. Given the area's association with witchcraft, Caroline didn't linger and hurriedly left. Soon, her car pulled up in front of a dilapidated villa. She called out several times, but there was no answer. It wasn't until she reached the garden that she saw a woman trimming an elderly person's hair. Shortly after, Luke, the estate's legal advisor, called out saying he was the one who had posted the job ad. Introduced by Luke, the lady of the house, Annie, promptly offered her the position and outlined her daily duties. She handed Caroline a master key that could unlock every room in the estate. However, she warned her to stay away from the attic, the very place where her husband had mysteriously suffered a stroke that left him paralyzed. As Caroline familiarized herself with the villa, she noticed something odd. There wasn't a single mirror anywhere in the house. Curious, she asked Annie why the mirrors had been removed, but Annie brushed her off with the vague excuse that she didn't want to see herself growing old. In the following days, as Caroline cared for Ben, her relationship with Annie gradually grew more cordial. One day, while taking Ben to the garden as usual, Annie asked her to fetch a box of seeds from the attic. As Caroline stepped into the attic, she noticed something strange, a cluttered shelf shaking violently. Curious, she approached and discovered a hidden door. She tried the master key, but it wouldn't budge. At that moment, Annie's voice called from below, and Caroline had no choice but to leave it for the time being. Back downstairs, Caroline asked Annie about the hidden door, but Annie responded vaguely, brushing off the question. The unusual attitudes of both Ben and Annie regarding the attic only heightened Caroline's curiosity about its secrets. That night, while Caroline was in the bathroom, a dark shadow flitted past a nearby door. Even more bizarrely, Ben, paralyzed from his stroke, somehow made his way to the roof while everyone was asleep. He had not only written a plea for help on the bedsheet, but was also desperately trying to distance himself from the house and Annie. Determined to uncover the truth, Caroline quietly slipped into the attic. She removed her hairpin to try picking the keyring, only to pull out a broken piece of a key. She then tried the master key again, and this time the door finally opened inside. The dark room was utterly chilling. The room contained not only an array of occult objects, but also dolls with their eyes and mouths sewn shut. On a nearby table, she also found a record titled Sacrifice and a serpent-shaped ring. Even stranger, under a dust cover, she discovered the mirrors that had vanished from the villa. As Caroline immersed herself in the eerie scene, Annie quietly appeared at the door, witnessing everything. Determined to uncover what was on the record, Caroline drove back into the city overnight and played the Sacrifice record. There was nothing unusual on the record, just a calm recording of church prayers. But her friend Daisy believed it was no ordinary prayer. It was a form of voodoo ritual. Through these incantations, practitioners could bless, curse, or even manipulate other people's souls. As long as the target did not believe in the magic, the spell would have no effect on them. Since the estate where Caroline worked was located near the birthplace of these practices, Daisy took her to a local dry cleaning shop. Daisy's aunt was an expert in these matters, and if Caroline had any questions, she could turn to her for help. Still skeptical of voodoo's reality, Caroline drove back to the villa. After checking on Ben as usual, she decided to test Annie's reaction by placing a mirror in his room. Sure enough, the next day, upon seeing the mirror in Ben's room, Annie lost control and scolded her furiously. Unfazed by Annie's outburst, Caroline confronted her and demanded to know what she had been hiding all this time. Finally, under the threat of resignation, Annie lit a cigarette and slowly revealed the century-old horrifying tale. 90 years ago, a banker built this estate and hired two stewards, Jasper and Cecil. They were well-known folk voodoo practitioners, but endured years of abuse and bullying from the banker. Then, during a lavish birthday celebration for the banker's children, numerous members of high society gathered at the estate. But as the party was winding down, two children mysteriously disappeared. After hours of searching, they finally found the two stewards and the children in the attic, surrounded by occult paraphernalia. Enraged, the guests tied the two stewards to a large tree on the estate grounds and brought gallons of gasoline and torches. Afterward, the banker used his wealth to bury the scandal and escape any consequences. But the misfortune didn't end there. He later shot his wife for no apparent reason before taking his own life. Everyone believed it was the steward's revenge, and after moving in, Annie and her husband often saw them. Ben eventually suffered a devastating stroke that left him completely paralyzed, prompting Annie to remove every mirror from the house. Yet all of this defied scientific explanation, and Caroline could not simply accept it. She resolved to stay and uncover the truth. That evening, while Caroline assisted Ben with his bath, she noticed his eyes fixed on a vanity mirror by the tub. To test the legend's truth, she opened the mirror and held it in front of Ben. The moment he saw his reflection, Ben's expression twisted with intense pain, and he reached out to smash the mirror. What she had witnessed began to shake Caroline's disbelief in voodoo, and that very night she drove back to the dry cleaner. At first sight, the practitioner sensed a trace of dark magic on Caroline. After hearing about Ben's symptoms, they gave her several items to ward off evil spirits. That night, while Annie slept, Caroline followed the instructions and performed a cleansing ritual on Ben. Strangely, Ben's eyes reflected not relief, but sheer disbelief, and tears welled up and streamed down his face. When the ritual ended, Ben actually managed to say Caroline's name and even tried to form words begging for help. At that moment, Caroline became convinced that Ben had been cursed, leaving him trapped in his paralyzed body and unable to speak. Meanwhile, Annie noticed something unusual upstairs, forcing Caroline to quickly hide the ritual items. She quickly asked Ben what he feared and why he had tried to escape. Trembling, he pointed directly at Annie as she entered the room. To cover up what had happened, Caroline hurriedly pretended she was simply washing Ben's face, barely avoiding suspicion. Clinging to her last hope, she photographed every piece of occult evidence in the attic and asked Luke to help her rescue Ben. She believed that as long as neither of them believed in the magic, Annie would have no power over them. On the way back, they passed the gas station again, and remembering the line of red brick dust she had seen before, Caroline decided to investigate. But when they reached the entrance marked with the red brick dust, Luke suddenly stopped and told Caroline to go in first, saying he would follow right behind her. Inside, Caroline once again heard the prayer from the sacrifice record, and nearby sat a blind, elderly woman. Desperate for answers, she asked about the sacrifice ritual, and the old woman's expression immediately turned fearful. The woman explained that the ritual was a dark form of magic that extended one person's life by transferring another person's life force into them. Thinking back to Ben's unexplained paralysis, Caroline became convinced that Annie had performed the ritual on him. She wanted to return to the estate immediately and save Ben, but Luke insisted they should gather evidence and wait for the police. Left with no choice, Caroline returned to the estate alone and sprinkled a line of red brick dust across the entrance rug to test her theory. She then claimed there was a leak and tried to lure Annie toward the doorway, but no matter what she said, Annie refused to go anywhere near the entrance. That was all the confirmation Caroline needed, and she decided she would take Ben and leave that very night. During dinner, while Annie stepped away from the table, Caroline quietly slipped a sedative into her cup of tea. After watching Annie unknowingly drink the tea, Caroline immediately announced that she was taking Ben with her. By the time Annie realized something was wrong and tried to stop her, the drug had already taken effect, and she collapsed to the floor. With trembling hands, Annie pulled out a ritual drawing and tried to cast a spell, but Caroline snatched it away before she had the chance. The symbol matched the sacrifice ritual she had seen in the attic, finally confirming Annie's scheme beyond any doubt. She rushed into Annie's room and searched through her belongings, quickly finding the sacrifice record along with a lock of her own hair. Without wasting a second, Caroline helped Ben into the car, only to discover that Annie had already locked the estate gates. She tried ramming the gate with the car, but the crash not only failed to open it, it completely destroyed the vehicle. Seeing Annie recovering and closing in, Caroline had no choice but to hide Ben inside a storage shed on the property. Dodging Annie's frantic gunfire, she grabbed the evidence and sprinted toward a small boat at the back of the estate. Fortunately, Just as Annie was about to catch her, Caroline managed to row away from the terrifying estate. After escaping, Caroline sought out Luke and showed him the evidence. Faced with the overwhelming proof, Luke finally believed that Annie had used dark magic against Ben. Just as they were about to call the police, Annie phoned them, and Luke quickly turned on a recorder to capture evidence. After hours of tension, Caroline finally had a moment to catch her breath, only to spot a few beginner law books and photographs of herself on Luke's desk. Inside a drawer, she found a broken skeleton key and the serpent-shaped ring, instantly realizing she had walked straight into a trap. Before she could react, Luke silently approached from behind and knocked her out cold. When she came to, she was back at the estate, and it became horrifyingly clear that Ben had never been the true sacrifice she was. In her desperation, she noticed the red brick dust by the doorway, and a daring plan began to form in her mind. She used Ben's hiding place as a distraction for Annie, then claimed she wanted to see a photo of her family one last time before she died. Seizing the moment while Luke hesitated, she bolted into a nearby room. Luckily, Luke was genuinely afraid of crossing the line of red brick dust, giving Caroline enough time to free herself and escape through a window. But as soon as she reached the window outside, she ran straight into Annie, and Luke, hearing the commotion, bolted out after her. With Annie and Luke blocking both escape routes, Caroline had no choice but to risk everything and make her way to the second floor. Once upstairs, she sealed every doorway with red brick dust, successfully preventing Luke from getting anywhere near her. But just as she was about to block the final doorway, Annie stepped through it. Annie hurled a handful of dust into her face, temporarily blinding her, and the two immediately grappled with each other. With her life on the line, Caroline found a surge of strength and shoved Annie down the staircase. Seeing Annie lying there barely alive, Luke flew into a rage, but he still couldn't get close because of the barrier created by the red brick dust. With a brief moment to catch her breath, Caroline quickly called emergency services before reaching out to her friend Daisy for help. Before she could finish the call, Annie and Luke cut the phone line, and Luke used a nearby elevator to bypass the barrier and reach the second floor. Out of options, Caroline ran for the attic, only to find that the entire ritual setup for her sacrifice was already waiting there. With Annie and Luke closing in, she had no choice but to place all her hopes in the protection spell. Following the instructions shown in the ritual diagram, she drew the protective sigil in chalk and activated it with her own hair and blood. The moment the ritual circle took effect, Annie burst through the door, but what she said plunged Caroline into despair once again.
You can't touch me. See this? This is your spell of protection.
Is that what that is now? All that circle protects is you from leaving it.
You stay back! Okay.
Waiting for you to believe. It doesn't work if you don't believe.
Meanwhile, outside the room, Luke began playing the incantation for the sacrifice ritual, while the mirrors around them flashed with visions of past victims who had been sacrificed over the years. As the entire house trembled violently, Annie suddenly hurled a mirror at Caroline. Even as Caroline desperately denied the existence of the magic, the mirror struck her and knocked her unconscious. Once silence settled over the room again, Caroline gradually came to.
Thank you, Joe. Fine now, Justified.
Damn bit harder than a lawyer, wasn't she?
It's harder every time. I just don't believe like they used to. Gotta get them riled up.
It quickly became clear that Annie and Caroline had swapped bodies during the ritual, and that they were in fact the same servants who had supposedly been killed at the party decades ago. Long before anyone could notice, they had already moved their souls into the bodies of the banker's children, adopting new appearances over the generations. They lured unsuspecting victims to the estate and used sacrificial rituals to seize their bodies, thereby achieving a twisted form of immortality. Every clue Caroline followed, and every question she raised had been carefully orchestrated as part of the ritual, guiding her inexorably toward becoming its ultimate victim. The estate was never truly haunted by spirits. The real curse lay in humanity's insatiable greed and obsessive nature. In the face of a meticulously crafted scheme of pure evil, every act of resistance or hope for salvation was nothing more than the futile, heartbreaking struggle of prey stepping blindly into the trap.